00131. Picking up a kid. After eating dinner with his family, Theo made a new clone before he changed into Ezekiel and portaled onto the roof of the Tombs apartment building in New York before he moved down into the building itself. A few minutes later, Ezekiel knocked on Adrian's door, and within a few moments Adrian opened the door before he said, "Hey Ezekiel, please come in. It might be a couple of minutes." Ezekiel followed Adrian into the small apartment and took a seat on the couch as Adrian sat across from him on a worn-out recliner. Once seated, Adrian asked, "I thought you were bringing a kid with you?" "Yeah, but we'll pick them up on the way," Ezekiel said. Adrian nodded in understanding as Doris came out of the back with her daughter in her arms. She smiled as she said, "Sorry for the wait. Ezekiel, I'd like you to meet our daughter Elizabeth." Elizabeth smiled as she said, "Hi, I'm Elizabeth, but my parents like to call me Liz. Mom said you work with Daddy." Ezekiel nodded as he stood up and said, "It's nice to meet you, Liz. I'm Ezekiel. And your mom is right. Your dad is helping me with a very important job." Ezekiel glanced at Adrian and asked, "Did you lock your front door?" "Yeah, I did." "Why?" "Because we're going to travel by magic, so we won't need to go out the front door," Ezekiel said. "Magic?" Adrian and Doris asked at the same time as Liz excitedly asked, "You know magic? Can you make a bunny appear out of a hat?" Ezekiel smirked and started to swirl one hand in a circle as he said, "I can do better than making a bunny appear from a hat. How about a magic portal to California?" As a portal appeared behind the family, Liz said, "But bunnies are cute." "I know someone who would agree with you, but magic portals are cooler," Ezekiel said. "No, bunnies are cooler." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Well, look behind you and tell me if a magic portal isn't cooler than a bunny." As the family turned around, they froze in place except Elizabeth, who asked in wonder, "What's that?" Ezekiel stepped around the family and into the portal as he said, "A magic portal to California. Now come along. We need to pick someone up." Ezekiel stood on the other side of the portal for a few seconds before Adrian's brain rebooted, and he asked, "What is that?" "I just told you. A magic portal to California. Just step through it." Adrian glanced at his wife, who was still in shock, and Liz, who stared at the glowing orange portal in wide-eyed wonder. Before Adrian tugged on Doris's arm and said, "Come on." Doris came out of her shock and asked, "Is it safe?" Ezekiel nodded before he said, "This is one of the safest forms of travel in the world. Just step through it." As the family cautiously moved closer to the portal, Liz reached out to touch the glowing orange edge before Doris stopped her as she said, "Don't touch that. It's dangerous." Ezekiel patiently waited for the family as they moved through the portal. Once on the other side, they looked around in wonder as the portal snapped closed. Before them was a beautiful view of the California coastline and ocean, while next to them was an infinity pool and some high-end furniture. As they took it all in, Ezekiel walked past them towards the back door of a white mansion. Ezekiel opened up the sliding glass door as a voice spoke out over the speakers all around the house. "This is a private residence, and you are currently trespassing. Please stay where you are as security has already been notified." As the Tombs turned around in shock again, Ezekiel asked, "Tony still hasn't added cameras and sensors, so you can watch the back of the house, Jarvis?" "Oh, my apologies, Mr. Ezekiel. I will inform Tony and security that it's you," Jarvis said. There was a quick pause before Jarvis said, "Mr. Stark has yet to expand my sensor capabilities, unfortunately. If I might inquire, is there a reason you didn't enter the house through the workshop? I brought guests this time, and you know how Tony is about his shop," Ezekiel said. Adrian and his family walked closer to Ezekiel as he asked, "Who are you talking to, Ezekiel?" Ezekiel turned back to Adrian as he said, "Just Jarvis. You can think of him as Tony's assistant, even though that's technically Pepper's job. Then again, Tony's so bad I guess he needs 2 assistants. More like 3. Happy said as he came out of the hallway leading to his security room. "I only need 1 assistant, and that's Pepper. Thank you very much," Tony said as he walked out of the stairwell leading down to his workshop. Ezekiel walked into the house, followed closely by the Tombs as he said, "Oh, really? What day is it?" Tony smirked as he confidently said, "It's Wednesday. Mr. Stark, it is currently Friday, the 5th of April, 2002. Jarvis said happily. Adrian and his wife both shared a look as Ezekiel said, I believe I proved my point. Anyways, are you ready? Tony frowned as he said, yeah, but you didn't prove anything. You know I always lose track of the hours when I'm working. Ezekiel gave Tony a flat look as he said, you lost track of 2 full days. I was busy with that tech you gave me. Don't try to blame me for. Ezekiel shook his head before he said, you know what, it doesn't matter. Ezekiel stepped aside as he waved a hand towards Adrian and his family as he said, I brought some guests. This is Adrian Toombs, his wife Doris, and their daughter Elizabeth. Ezekiel pointed at Tony as he said, and this is the kid I told you I was bringing with me. Tony Stark. Hey, what do you mean I'm a kid? Tony asked. Happy chuckled as he said, he's right. I don't pay you to side with him. Tony said as he crossed his arms over his chest. Mr. Stark, I believe that Mr. Ezekiel is correct with his assertion in labeling you a child. You're typical. Shut it, Jarvis. No one asked you. Tony said with a huff. Ezekiel and Happy couldn't stop themselves as they laughed at Tony, who shot a glare at Ezekiel as he said, this is all your fault. You programmed him to be like this. Ezekiel stopped laughing as he said, I know, but it's for your own good. It builds character. Adrian finally spoke up as he asked, programmed? Ezekiel nodded as he said, Jarvis is short for, just a rather very intelligent system. But it would be easier to think of him as a pseudo-AI. AI like the thing in Terminator? Adrian asked in concern. Tony moved closer as he said, kinda, but only in the most basic sense. Jarvis isn't really AI. So it's AI but not AI? Adrian asked. Jarvis isn't in it. Tony corrected. Oh, sorry. Tony stepped close and extended his hand as he said, it's fine. It's nice to meet you, by the way. How do you know Ezekiel? As they shook hands, Adrian said, I just signed a contract with him, and he invited us to dinner afterwards. Tony cast a glance at Ezekiel as he said, really? What are you two working on? Ezekiel waved it off as he said, just some stuff for vibe. It's not a big deal. As Tony introduced himself to Doris and Liz, Ezekiel glanced at Happy and said, you ready to go? Yup. But are you sure I should leave my weapon? Ezekiel nodded as he said, yeah, Tony will be fine. We are going to the safest place on the planet. Wait, where exactly are we going? Adrian asked. Josha. Ezekiel said as he smiled. Wait, are we even allowed there? I heard they have strict policies on anyone even visiting the place. Doris asked in concern. You'll be fine. You're coming as my guests. Oh, do you live there? Adrian asked. No, I just bankrolled the whole thing, which gives me free rein to come and go as I please. I don't normally bring guests, though. Ezekiel turned to Tony as he said, the only rule is, when you see someone with visible mutations, don't stare. Why are you talking to me like I'm a kid? You should be telling her that. Tony said as he pointed at Liz. Because I trust Liz not to stare. Maybe it would be better if you wear glasses while you're there. Ezekiel said as he rubbed his chin in thought. Tony wanted to argue before Ezekiel said, whatever, it's fine. You'll be with me anyways. Ezekiel glanced at everyone before he asked, you guys ready? Adrian and his family nodded as Happy asked, wasn't Pepper going to join us? Oh, I knew I forgot someone. Jarvis, do you know where Pepper is? Ezekiel asked. Miss Potts just arrived at the front gate along with Major Rhodes. They will both join you shortly. Ezekiel glanced at Tony as he asked, you invited Rhodey? Tony glanced away as he said, no. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, you're a terrible liar. But it's fine. Rhodey can join us. Everyone chatted for about a minute before Pepper and Rhodey joined them. After short introductions, Ezekiel made a portal as he said, once you're on the other side, don't take off. We'll basically be in the customs line at the airport. After everyone stepped through the portal, they were greeted by a room filled with runic scripts that covered every inch of the walls, floor, and ceiling. Everyone glanced around in wonder as Tony asked, what is this place? It's one of the portal rooms for Josha. It's basically the only real way to enter the country now. I doubt that. Someone can easily fly a plane to the island or drive a boat here. Tony said. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, ask Rhodey. The U.S. has tried to fly by the island almost 10 times now. They also tried to reach the island with drones. None of it worked. I can neither confirm nor deny anything you just said, Rhodey said as he kept a straight face. Ezekiel smirked as he said, we can discuss this more later, but for now let's get going. The restaurant will be crowded soon with a dinner rush if we're not careful. As they started to walk towards the only exit point in the room, Pepper asked, why would there be a dinner rush? From my understanding, shouldn't it be around 10 p.m. here? Ezekiel nodded as he opened the door leading out of the room and gestured for everyone to exit as he said, by normal time zone standards you're correct. But a lot of people visit Josha every day, and they live in other parts of the world. So Josha kinda turned into this 24-hour hub for the visitors. As they stepped out into the main area of the portal hub, they were greeted by white marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and a small circular desk with a few people seated at it. Behind them along the wall were 9 other identical doors to the one they just exited. Ezekiel motioned everyone to follow him as he said, even though this is the entry point for the country, there's no security check. That desk over there is just a help desk for visitors. I thought you said we were going to be in a security line for customs? Tony asked. Ezekiel smirked as he said, I just said that so you wouldn't run off alone. As they walked towards the exit, Ezekiel waved at the people who worked the help desk before Rhodey asked, why would there be no security check for visitors? That seems like a pretty big safety concern. Yeah, you said I didn't need to bring my service weapon because this place was safe. No security checks doesn't sound very safe to me, Happy said. Ezekiel smiled as he said, Josha is only reachable by a few hundred people in the world currently. If you can't make a magic portal, you can't portal into the hub. And to be able to portal into the hub, you need to be added into the runes. I was your security check to get here. As they exited the building, they walked out into a small city center with some people walking around going about their business. The city center was a mix of modern technology and nature, with winding, elegant brick walkways going to different buildings. Surrounding all the walkways was grass along with decent-sized fruit trees. Small benches were set out along the pathways and under some of the trees. The center point of the area, which was directly in front of the building they just exited, was a lifelike statue of metahumans with physical deformities standing together with normal people. Under the statue, inscribed on the base, was, working to build a world of understanding and compassion. Everyone was quiet as they took in the statue in front of them before Ezekiel said, I'll show you around the place for a bit after dinner, but let's get going so we can get a good table. 00132. Ezekiel has a fan club? As Ezekiel and his group finished up dinner at a restaurant with an amazing cliffside view of the ocean, a new portal opened up in the same portal room Ezekiel used. A few seconds later, it was filled with a group of teens and kids. As they started to move towards the door, a young girl stopped and sniffed the air a few times. A girl that looked like an older copy of the sniffing girl turned around and asked, What's wrong, Gabby? Gabby sniffed the air a few more times before she grinned wide and said, Ezekiel's here. Sky, who was standing close to Gabby, said, We just saw Ezekiel at the base. No, that was one of his clones. The real Ezekiel is here, Gabby said as she started to move towards the door. Cecily smiled and said, Let's go find him. Leech, who was holding Cecily's hand, said, I want to see Ezekiel too. Yeah, let's go find him, Ava said as she followed after Gabby. I thought we were going to the amusement park? Yelena asked as she looked at her sister. Natasha shrugged as she said, We can go after we find Ezekiel. Maybe he'll join us at the amusement park. Grant, who was holding his little brother's hand, said, Well, let's get going. Gabby is gonna leave us behind. The group of kids all followed behind Gabby as she slowly led them towards the restaurant. Inside the restaurant, Ezekiel finished paying the bill as he asked, How about I give you a tour of the island before we leave? Doris looked at her watch to check the time. It was getting close to Liz's bedtime. So she thought about going home now to get Liz ready for bed. But when she looked at the smile on her daughter's face as she finished her cake, she decided to take the tour around the island first. Today was special. Liz could stay up a little later tonight. After everyone agreed, Ezekiel led his group out of the restaurant where someone yelled out, Ezekiel! Before a young girl with black hair ran towards him at full speed. Ezekiel was able to catch the girl in a hug as he said, It's good to see you too, Gabby. As she squeezed Ezekiel in a tight hug, Gabby said, You never visit me. What are you talking about? I see you every day. Gabby sniffed Ezekiel before she said, Those things aren't you. They don't even smell. While my clones might not be the real me, they're still a copy of me. So whenever we talk, you're still talking to me. Ezekiel said as he patted Gabby's head with one hand. Gabby looked up as she asked, Really? Ezekiel nodded as he said, Yup. But if it makes you happy, I'll try and visit you in person when I have free time. Gabby narrowed her eyes as she asked, You promise? Ezekiel held out a pinky and wiggled it as he said, Pinky promise. Gabby let go of her hug, then reached up and locked pinkies with Ezekiel as she said, Pinky promise. While Ezekiel's group watched his interaction with Gabby, another group of almost 20 kids ran up to Ezekiel. Most of them looked like normal kids, but Leech and Cecily, who stopped holding hands while they ran after Gabby, stood out. Laura was the first one who reached them as she wasn't in the main group and said, You took off Gabby. Mom told you to stay close when we go out. Gabby fidgeted with a smile on her face as she said, Sorry, I was just excited. Laura karate chopped Gabby's head as she said, I know, but you always take off. Gabby rubbed her head as she said, Sorry. Laura ignored her sister as she moved a little closer to Ezekiel and sniffed him a few times. When she finished, she stepped back and said, You do smell nice. Tony, wondering what was going on, moved next to Ezekiel as he asked, What's up with the fan club of kids? Ezekiel smiled as he said, Just some friends I've helped out over the years. The main group of kids finally arrived, and Leech moved to hug Ezekiel as he said, Friend Ezekiel. Ezekiel returned the hug as he said, It's good to see you too, Leech. After Ezekiel released his hug with Leech, he said, You slipped back to your old speech habit. Leech rubbed the back of his head as he said, It happens when I get excited. Ezekiel patted the boy's head as he said, It's fine, buddy. You're doing a good job with your lessons. Cecily stepped close to Ezekiel and went in for a hug as she said, He's put in a lot of effort. Ezekiel returned the hug before he said, Well, he has a good teacher, so keep up the good work, both of you. After that, Ezekiel greeted the other kids and gave a quick introduction to both groups before Gabby tugged on Ezekiel's hand and asked, Can you come with us to the amusement park? Ezekiel wanted to refuse, but most of the other kids asked the same thing right afterwards. When Ezekiel looked at his group, he saw Liz's eyes light up at the mention of the amusement park, so he asked, You guys want to check out the amusement park? Liz looked at her parents with puppy dog eyes, and it made Adrian share a look with his wife before he said, We're just along for the ride, so we'll go wherever. Tony smirked as he said, The amusement park sounds good to me. If I take some videos there, it will probably get me more followers on Vibe. Ezekiel shook his head before he said, All right, let's head to the amusement park then. As the kids quickly celebrated, Gabby held on to Ezekiel's hand and said, Come on, let's go. I want to ride the coasters with you. As the new, larger group moved towards the amusement park, Tony, who was walking beside Ezekiel, asked, You said you helped all these kids out? Are they all metahumans? Ezekiel shrugged as he said, No, just kids that were living in bad situations, and I gave them a helping hand. I used to live in the sewers. Leech said as he was following behind Ezekiel and Tony. Gabby cheerfully said next, I was cloned in a lab with my sisters. Natasha, who was walking close to Gabby and Laura, said, Me and my sister were being trained as assassins before Ezekiel found us. Cecily glanced back to see Sky, Ava, Grant, and his little brother Thomas talking to Liz and her parents near the back of the group, so she said, I was kidnapped and my parents were killed before Ezekiel found me in a lab. Tony, Pepper, Happy, and Rhodey all looked between the kids and couldn't believe what they all just said. So Pepper glanced at Ezekiel as she asked, Are they joking? Unfortunately, they aren't. Ezekiel said as he sadly shook his head. Ezekiel glanced around at the kids next to him and said, But that's all in the past. Now stop making the adult depressed. You're gonna make Uncle Tony cry. I'm not gonna cry. And I'm no one's uncle. Tony said as he punched Ezekiel's shoulder. The conversation changed to more normal topics as they continued to walk toward the amusement park. Along the way, they ran into a bunch of different people who all stopped to greet Ezekiel. Ezekiel always returned the greeting and also seemed to know each person's name. After a while, they finally arrived at the entrance of the amusement park and Tony said, I'll pay this time since you bought dinner. Ezekiel smiled as he said, How generous of you. but the amusement park is currently free to the public. Tony raised an eyebrow as he asked, why would an amusement park be free? Because it's still in the testing phase. Once we have everything dialed in, there will be a small fee to enter. The food, carnival games, and arcades still cost money. But the entry, rides, go-karts, laser tag, and other things are all free. Ezekiel said as he led the group inside. Once inside, Ezekiel glanced down at Gabby, who was still holding his hand, and asked, where to? Gabby started to lead him by the hand as she said, roller coaster. Roller coaster? But laser tag is more fun, Natasha said as she followed along. Cecily chuckled as she said, you only say that because you always get the highest score. Natasha smiled as she said, it's not my fault if everyone else can't aim. Laura shook her head as she said, it has nothing to do with aiming. It's just you and the other girls take laser tag too seriously. Ezekiel smirked as he asked Tony, what about a friendly game of laser tag after the roller coaster? Laser tag with kids? That doesn't sound fun. Ezekiel chuckled as he asked, what? You don't think you can beat some kids in laser tag? Tony glanced at the kids for a moment before he said, no, I don't want them to be upset when I do. You wish, old man. It's a good thing you don't want to play. We wouldn't want you to break a hip or something. Natasha said with a smirk, old man? I'm only 32, you little brat. Tony said. Natasha glanced at Tony as she said, whatever you say, Grandpa. That's it. I'll show you who's old. Where's the laser tag at? Tony asked with a frown on his face. Natasha smirked and pointed to the left as she said, it's this way, Grandpa. Want me to hold your hand so you don't get lost? I heard that happens to senior citizens. Tony smiled as he said, just wait. This old man is gonna humble you. Happy, Rhodey. Come on. We need to teach this kid a lesson. She was only calling you an old man. Why do I need to help you out? Rhodey asked. Natasha glanced at Rhodey before she said, at least the other grandpa knows he doesn't stand a chance. Tony and Rhodey shared a glance before they nodded to each other. Then Tony glanced back at Natasha as he said, all right, let's go. Natasha glanced back at her sister and asked, Yelena, want to go beat some old men in laser tag? Yeah, let's go. Yelena said before she took off running towards the laser tag area. Natasha glanced at Laura and asked, you in for some laser tag? Laura nodded before she looked at Ezekiel and asked, will you watch over Gabby for a while? Ezekiel smiled as he said, yeah, and we'll come to laser tag after we ride the roller coaster. Thank you, Laura said before she looked at Gabby and said, stay with Ezekiel and no running off, or I'll tell Mom. Gabby nodded her head, and when Laura turned around to walk away, Gabby stuck out her tongue. As Tony's new group started to leave and go towards the laser tag area, Pepper said, I'm gonna go with Tony. I'll keep him in line so he isn't too hard on those kids. Ezekiel smiled as he said, I'm more worried about Tony getting bullied by the kids. He's in for a world of trouble. After that, the group split up a bit more with about half the kids going to laser tag and the other half going to the roller coaster. Ezekiel was left with Gabby, Cecily, Leech, the Tombs, Sky, Ava, Grant, Thomas, and 2 other girls from the Widow program. While everyone else went to play laser tag, it took a few minutes for the smaller group to make it to the roller coaster, which was massive and wrapped around most of the park. After looking at the roller coaster for a few moments, Adrian glanced at his daughter before he said, this doesn't look like it was made for kids. Ezekiel smiled as he said, normally you're right, but this coaster was made with the help of magic, so anyone can ride it. Gabby pulled on Ezekiel's hand as she said, come on, I want to ride it at least twice. 00133, dropping more hints for Tony. After riding the roller coaster 3 times, Ezekiel and his group slowly made their way to the laser tag area. They stopped a few times to play carnival games along the way, and to win Liz a giant stuffed bunny. Adrian tried to win it at first, but he wasn't having much luck at the game. Leech was the one who ended up winning the bunny though, since it turned out he's really good at ring toss. When they finally reached the laser tag area, they found Tony, Rhodey, and Happy collapsed on a bench breathing hard and covered in sweat. Ezekiel smiled as he walked up and asked, so how did it go? Tony glanced up before he asked, how is this laser tag? Rhodey nodded in agreement before he said, this place is more like an urban training course for a Delta Force team. Yeah, And what's up with the laser packs? How come you get shocked whenever you get hit? Happy said as he rubbed his chest. Natasha, who stood by the entrance with a smile on her face, said, "It's because we played the advanced version. If we played on the pro level, you would get disabled and won't be able to move till after one team wins. You also wear a full bodysuit, and wherever you get hit it feels like you've been shot." Tony looked up in shock at Ezekiel as he asked, "How is any of that meant to be in an amusement park? And why would someone want to feel what it's like to be shot? Actually, how would that even work?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "The general public gets to use the normal laser tag course. But if people want, they can challenge themselves to the advanced and pro course after signing a liability waiver. As for how it works, it's a mix of technology and magic." "You didn't answer why, though," Tony said. "You would have to ask the people who designed the place. They were the ones who insisted on making it. I just paid for everything." "Well, I did make the capture the flag and bomb planting game modes," Ezekiel said. Tony shook his head as he said, "Who was crazy enough to want to make something like that?" Natasha smirked as she said, "My parents." Tony glanced at Natasha before he said, "That might explain a few things." Natasha planted her hands on her hips as she asked, "And what exactly is that supposed to mean, old man?" "It explains why you're so good. You're as crazy as your parents," Tony said. Natasha smiled as she said, "Thank you." Tony mumbled to himself as he said, "That wasn't really a compliment." Gabby, who was still holding Ezekiel's hand, asked, "Can we play laser tag? I want to be on your team." "I don't mind, but I can only play normal laser tag though." Tony chuckled as he asked, "What? Afraid of the advanced and pro version of the game?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Both of them work with magic, and I'm currently channeling a magic spell. There's a small chance the magic from the game could affect my spell, so I'm just being cautious." Ezekiel glanced down at Gabby as he asked, "Is normal laser tag fine with you?" Gabby nodded and tugged on Ezekiel's arm as she said, "Sure, let's go." Pretty much everyone joined for the normal laser tag game, including another group of kids to make 2 teams of 30. Tony, Rhodey, and Happy ended up doing better in normal laser tag. But Natasha, Yelena, Ezekiel, Gabby, and Laura ended up taking the top spots on the team. Tony was close to the top 5, but the kids had the advantage of knowing the course. Ava would have had first place, but she ran around the course as she used her powers, so Ezekiel had her point score disqualified from the rankings for cheating. It's one of the perks of writing the software that runs the whole place. After they finished and were walking out of the area, Ezekiel asked, "All right, since Gabby picked the last 2, how about we go race go-karts now?" "Sure," Gabby said as she took Ezekiel's hand again. "Go-karts? What kind of carts are they?" Tony asked. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "We have 4 different types, with the fastest reaching a top speed of 80. Tony glanced at Natasha as he said, "Let's go, brat. You might have one in laser tag, but you won't beat me in a race." "Whatever you say, Grandpa," Natasha said with a smirk. No one complained about going to race go-karts, so the new bigger group headed over to the area with the go-karts. Once there, the group split up because not everyone could race the more powerful carts. Adrian and his family went to a kid kart section with a few of the younger kids, while Ezekiel led Tony and a few others to the pro karts. The pro kart course actually wrapped around the whole go-kart area and acted as the barrier for it. The track itself had a lot of turns and some long straights with a small hill climb in one section that raised the track over the entrance to the go-kart area. It was followed by a winding downhill section that ended where the race started. The overall course was just over 1.5 miles, which made it longer than some race car tracks. After getting suited up and getting into their own carts, Tony, Natasha, Rhodey, Happy, Laura, Cecily, and Ezekiel all lined up waiting for the green light, while Pepper, Leech, and Gabby all took seats in the stands. Pepper, since she didn't want to race, and the others because they couldn't. The stands themselves had a good view of the downhill section and finish line, but it was also filled with video screens that showed each racer as they went around the track. It also had a main screen that would show the best action at any moment of the race. As they were all lined up, Tony glanced back at Ezekiel, who was in the back of the pack with him, but in last place, as he asked, "Why exactly are we back here?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "It would be too easy otherwise. Unless you suck at driving, in which case this is going to be a tough race for you." Tony smirked as he said, "Oh, You think you can drive a? Ezekiel smiled as he said, who knows? A couple moments later, the light changed to green and everyone took off around the track. The first half of the lap was pretty tame with Tony and Ezekiel slowly moving up through the other drivers. Happy and Natasha were the only other people who had any type of skill and ended up fighting for first place as Tony and Ezekiel slowly caught up to them. It was just before the uphill section that Tony and Ezekiel caught up to them and started to fight for first place. Ezekiel was the one who pulled ahead into first place on the uphill section, since he only weighed half of what Natasha weighed, and she already weighed less than Happy and Tony. His lead wasn't large as the course flattened out and they moved into the downhill portion. That section was the hardest part of the whole race with a handful of tight hairpin turns leading down to the finish line. As they entered the area, Tony was only 2 cart lengths behind and on the first turn, he closed in to 1.5. Since Ezekiel was in the front, he couldn't see it, but Tony was better at taking the tight corners of this section of the track. As they ended the downhill section, Tony was just behind Ezekiel and was trying to pass him. Ezekiel was lucky as the last part of the track before the finish line was slightly uphill, so he pulled slightly ahead as they started the second lap. During the first section of the second lap, Tony pulled ahead into first place and with his skills was able to take a slight lead. Ezekiel tried his best to keep up, but Tony had a lot more practice and always took the best line possible around corners. By the time they reached the main uphill section, Tony was about 3 cart lengths ahead. Ezekiel, with his reduced weight, easily caught up to Tony, and they ended up even coming into the downhill section of the race. As they entered the first turn of the downhill, Tony was able to smoothly drift around the corner and pull back into the lead. Ezekiel copied his move, but wasn't able to do it perfectly, which let Tony pull slightly ahead. Ezekiel knew he couldn't beat Tony on the downhill after he followed him down it. Tony's skill level was either close to or slightly better than his dad's when it came to racing go-karts. So Ezekiel focused on staying as close as possible to Tony on the last lap. He would overtake him on the uphill, and then do his best to hold that lead till the finish line. Ezekiel's plan worked out correctly, and when they came to the uphill section of the last lap, Tony was only a few feet ahead of him as they started to climb up that section of the track. By the time they reached the top and it leveled out, Ezekiel was in the lead by a whole cart length. Ezekiel focused as much as he could to copy Tony's line from the second lap, and while it wasn't perfect, it helped to keep Tony just behind him for the first half of the downhill. In the second half, Tony was able to cut in on a turn Ezekiel took a little wide and forced them into a neck-and-neck race. But with Tony's skill, he was able to pull slightly ahead as they entered the final stretch of uphill track. Ezekiel had his pedal floored as they charged up the slight incline towards the finish line. Seconds passed as Ezekiel's cart slowly creeped up on Tony's. As they approached the last 20 feet of track, both carts were dead even. Then they were past the finish line and slowed down to enter the cart return area. Once they were parked, Tony glanced over with a smile as he said, "Looks like I won." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Yup, you beat Natasha. And you." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "I don't know about that. No, I clearly won the race. I was easily a few inches ahead." Tony said. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "You forgot our starting positions." "What? We started at the back together." As they stripped out of their jumpsuits, Ezekiel said, "Let's just go out and check the results." A minute later, they were outside by the seating area where the race results were posted. Gabby, Pepper, and Leech were also there, and Tony could see that Ezekiel finished first in the race. He double-checked the results before he said, "But I clearly passed the finish line first." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "But I started in last place. Which means to beat me, you had to be a full cart length ahead of me, just like our starting positions." Gabby nodded along as she said, "Yeah, Ezekiel won. Don't be a sore loser." "How am I a sore loser? I clearly won. Plus, why is that even a rule? This isn't a professional race where something like that should matter," Tony said with a huff. Ezekiel smirked as he said, "I designed the place and programmed the software that tracks the race." Tony shook his head as he said, "You went a little overboard with the design. This is a go-kart track," says the guy who was trying to add a hologram projector to their phone. Ezekiel said with a flat look. Tony glanced away as he said, "Fine, you win this time," before he looked at Natasha and said, "At least I beat you, brat." Natasha smiled as she said, "I didn't want you to cry if you lost again, Grandpa." but it looks like you're crying anyways. Tony was about to reply as Ezekiel glanced down at Gabby and Leech and asked, "Want to head over to the mid-range carts so you can race?" "Yeah, let's go," Gabby said as she took Ezekiel's hand and started to pull him to the other cart area. Tony looked at Natasha and was about to say something when Pepper pushed his shoulder and said, "Just leave it alone, Tony." Rhodey nodded as he said, "Stop being goaded by a teenager." "Fine," Tony said as he started to follow after Ezekiel. When they made it to the other track, they found most of the group along with the Tombs who just showed up. Liz raced by herself on the kid carts and wanted to try the faster carts, so she convinced her dad to take her on one. Instead of joining the race, Ezekiel and most of the adults decided not to join this time. Only Adrian joined since he was driving the cart for Liz. As everyone was getting set up in their carts, Ezekiel moved off to one side to observe the race and was shortly joined by Tony. They sat in silence for a minute before Tony said, "I'm surprised you like go-karts so much." As the race started, Ezekiel said, "Picked it up from my dad. He's a gearhead and loves to race go-karts." "Really? You should bring him by the house sometime. I'll let him drive any of the cars I have. Then we can come back here and race some go-karts and see who's better," Tony said with a smile. Ezekiel smiled a little before he said, "I'll think about it." As Adrian and Liz were coming down the track towards the area where Ezekiel and Tony stood, Ezekiel pointed towards them and asked, "So you put any thought into what I suggested about a while ago?" Tony glanced at Adrian and his daughter before he shook his head and said, "I'm not going to settle down. Being single is too much fun." "You sure? Look at them. A father spending quality time with his daughter. That looks a lot more fun than any vapid fling you've had recently," Ezekiel said as he shook his head. Tony just watched Adrian race his daughter around the track for a while, before Ezekiel finally said, "Whatever. You don't have to take my advice. But if you ever change your mind, I can introduce you to someone who could help you out." I don't need help finding a woman." Ezekiel reached over and patted Tony on the back as he said, "I know that, you idiot. I was talking about a therapist." 00134. Ezekiel isn't normal. A few days after taking everyone to Genosha, Theo found something interesting. Well, it was more than that. Theo found someone interesting he was looking for. There were a lot of people he was on the lookout for in this new world, but so far he'd only found a few. The technology being at its current level was the main issue. Yes, computers, cameras, and other devices were more advanced, but without tablets, cell phones, or smart home devices, Theo was finding it hard to track people down. It was the main reason he pushed the cell phone project forward with Tony. As for who Theo found, well, that was a little bit of a surprise for Theo. He was actually excited to meet them, since he enjoyed the movies based on the guy. The man's name was Eric Brooks, better known as Blade or the Daywalker. He is a half-vampire who hunted down other vampires. Theo lucked out finding Blade since the guy apparently lived as a ghost. He had no traceable records and Theo only found him because of a police report that caught his attention. There was a rave in some meat packing facility in New York, and besides a lot of human blood, ash, silver bullets, and bullet casings, they found a couple of people who were babbling wrecks, who talked about vampires. Theo had a clone visit them in the hospital and probe their minds, which is how he found out about Blade and even learned what he looked like. He was a buffer and big version of the actor who played him in the movies. Theo's clone also gave each person some mental help to get over the trauma they suffered before the clone left. With the knowledge that Blade was alive in this world and what he looked like, Theo sent out clones into the city to find him and his base of operations. It took a couple days, but Theo found the warehouse Blade and an older man named Whistler used as their current base. After his clones scouted the place, Theo decided to pay a little visit. It was around 2 a.m. when Blade and Whistler came back to their hideout. They just cleaned out a large nest of vampires and came back to resupply. When they stepped out of the car, Blade quickly noticed something was off and placed a hand on one of his guns, which made Whistler go on edge and also place a hand on his sidearm. "I have to say, that's impressive. But then again, I'm an amateur when it comes to concealment," Ezekiel said as he stepped out from around a corner with his hands raised. Blade almost snarled as he asked, "Who are you?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Just a friendly stranger who wanted to introduce himself and offer you my services." Whistler studied Ezekiel for a few moments before he said, "In our business, strangers normally mean trouble. Well, how about we change that? My name's Ezekiel, and you gentlemen are Abraham Whistler and Eric Brooks. Or do you prefer to use the name Blade? Ezekiel said with a smile. Blade shared a glance with Whistler before he said, You're not a vampire, but you don't smell human either. Ezekiel, with his arms still raised, sniffed his right armpit before he said, I just smell deodorant. Blade wore a thin smile that showed a little of his teeth as he said, You need a better nose. Now what do you want? Like I said, I wanted to introduce myself and offer my services. Do you mind if I lower my arms? Ezekiel asked. Blade moved away from the car and came a little closer to Ezekiel as he asked, The introductions are done. Now tell us what you are. Ezekiel went to lower his hands as he said, Metahuman, just like you. When he finished, Blade was already in front of him with his sword touching Ezekiel's neck as he said, One wrong move and you die. Ezekiel smirked as he asked, Are you sure about that? Kid, I think we might have a problem. Whistler said. Blade glanced behind him to see a silver-haired man holding a knife to Whistler's throat. When he looked back at Ezekiel, Blade felt something metallic touch his own neck as the person behind him asked, So what's your next move? Blade gritted his teeth, but cautiously removed his sword from Ezekiel's throat. Ezekiel smiled and rubbed his neck as he said, Stand down. We didn't come here to make enemies. When the knife at his throat disappeared, Blade glanced back at Whistler to see him standing alone again. He cautiously turned back to Ezekiel and asked, What do you want? To offer my services and possibly make some new friends. But that's up to you, if you want to accept either one. Ezekiel said with a smile. Blade put away his sword and walked past Ezekiel as he said, Fine. Ezekiel glanced at Blade for a moment before he turned to look at Whistler, who said, Don't mind him. He doesn't like new people, that's all. It's fine. I expected as much. Well, I didn't expect to be greeted by a sword, but there's a first time for everything. Ezekiel said as he shrugged. Whistler limped over and stuck out his hand as he said, Just call me Whistler. Ezekiel, it's nice to meet you. After they shook hands, Whistler said, Let's go inside so I can sit down and then we'll talk. Ezekiel nodded before he followed Whistler into the hideout. Once inside, they found Blade at a table as he disassembled a gun to clean it. Whistler went to the fridge and pulled out a couple of beers before he sat at the table with Blade. After Ezekiel sat down, Whistler held out one of the beers and asked, Want one? Ezekiel shook his head before he said, No thanks. Whistler opened his own bottle and took a large drink before he asked, More for me then. So what did you want to offer us? Funding would be the main thing, but support, weapons, specialized medical help. Ezekiel pointed at Whistler's leg as he said, Fixing your leg would be no issue for us, or even bringing someone back from the brink of death. We would also provide backup when you need it and more. Ezekiel said. Blade frowned slightly as Whistler took another drink. He studied his bottle and then his busted leg for a few moments before he asked, Do you even know what we do? Hunt vampires. Whistler nodded as he asked, So why do you want to help us out? Was your family killed by vampires or something? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, No, nothing like that. I'm just trying to make the world a better place, and as far as I can tell, vampires aren't conducive to that goal. Heh, you're right about that, Whistler said before he took another drink. Ezekiel glanced between Blade and Whistler before he asked, So what do you think? Blade and Whistler shared a look before Whistler said, We'll think about it. Ezekiel nodded as he stood up and said, I figured as much. Since that's the case, I'll leave you with a way to contact me. A moment later, a man appeared next to Ezekiel with a large briefcase. Whistler didn't see him approach, but tensed up after he just appeared out of thin air. Blade also tensed up, but he did it sooner, since he saw the man as he approached the table. The man moved faster than Blade himself could move, but Blade was at least able to track his movements slightly. Ezekiel took the briefcase from the man, who instantly disappeared a moment later, before he placed it on the table and opened it up. He spun it towards Whistler as he said, You can use the phone to contact me, and the other stuff can be considered a gift. Whistler looked at the contents of the briefcase before he said, That's one hell of a gift. He looked up a moment later to see Ezekiel had already disappeared. He shook his head as he turned the briefcase to Blade and asked, What do you think? I don't trust him. Someone showing up out of the blue and saying they want to help. Normal people don't do that, Blade said. Whistler nodded as he said, I'll agree with you on that. But then again, people in our line of work aren't exactly normal. What should we do with this silver and the phone? Let's just toss the phone in the safe for now. The silver we'll test. If it's pure, we'll use it for our next batch of bullets. Whistler took another drink of his beer before he said, for some reason he looked familiar to me. Blade nodded as he said, I felt the same way. VVVVV. A couple of days passed by with no word from Blade or Whistler. But Theo knew they were still in New York from the weird police reports he kept getting. Since Theo had other things he needed to do, he put them out of his mind and focused on his other projects. He checked in with Hank and his team. They were still in the quantum realm. Even with the help of the drones, Minato, and Tobarama, only about 10% of the place was explored so far. They'd also run into some locals finally, which gave Agatha something to do. She ended up visiting each of the groups with the help of Minato and talked with them for a day or two. It was mostly for information gathering, but it was also to stave off her boredom. Luckily, she only needed to stay there till the end of the month, before Kaiselius would take over for her. He agreed to take over for her, in exchange for alchemy lessons. After Hank, Theo checked on things around the base and even visited the kids in person. He also had some clones start expanding the base a little bit. Even though most of the Valkyries currently lived in Genosha, some of them moved into the base because it just felt better to them. So instead of possibly running out of room, Theo decided to expand the base now. Theo also checked in with Adrian to see how things were going. Even though Theo threw him into the deep end, the man took everything in stride and had a decent business plan already set up. Tony also shared contact information with him and put him in contact with a couple people to help buy all the equipment he would need for his company and the job itself. Theo also told Adrian not to worry about renting out a place for his company. He could use one of the buildings Theo owned just outside of the demolition area to run his business until the job was completed and to not worry about the rent. After that, Theo focused on training and finishing his mind defense. Well, that wasn't actually true. His mental defense was already complete. But according to Tao and Agatha, a person's mental defense was never finished. It could always be improved by adding another layer to it, whether that was a softer inner layer or more solid outer layer. The main thing was to remember it was never done and could always be improved, so Theo set aside at least an hour a day for it. A couple weeks passed by in relative peace before Blade contacted Ezekiel. It was late at night as Theo climbed his rock wall and trained his chakra control. As he pulled himself up to the next hand, an alert went off at his computer, and one of his clones checked it before it said, Blade's calling from the phone you gave him. Theo channeled some chakra to his feet before he let go of his hands and attached his feet to the wall. Then he used body flicker to reach his computer as he switched into Ezekiel to answer the call and said, This is Ezekiel. Blade's voice was a little hoarse as he asked, You said you can bring someone back from the brink of death, right? Was that a lie? Ezekiel typed on his computer as he said, No, it wasn't. He could hear Blade doing something before he said, Whistler's dying. Can you save him? Do what you can to keep him stable. I'll be there soon. 00135. Homines Nocturni. A few hours ago, Whistler went out with Blade to check into a new nest they found, but they ended up getting split apart halfway through their mission. While separated, Whistler was caught by a group of vampires after he ran out of ammo and was beaten so badly, Blade thought he was already dead when he found the old man. Whistler looked like a jigsaw puzzle in a pool of blood with a couple of pieces missing. It also looked like a lot of his bones were broken in the body parts that still remained. As Blade moved next to Whistler, he coughed up some blood and said in a weak voice, My bag. Blade glanced to the side where Whistler's backpack was before he said, We don't need it. I need to get you to a hospital. No. The phone. In my bag. Whistler said between short, ragged breaths. Phone? The phone for Ezekiel? Blade asked as he reached for the backpack. Whistler coughed up a little more blood before he said, Yes. Blade was quick as he dumped out the bag onto the ground, before he picked up the phone from the pile of equipment on the ground. After he flipped it open, he noticed it only had two buttons, one of which was a green call button and the other a red end button. He pushed the green button, and after 2 rings the phone picked up and he heard, This is Ezekiel. You said you can bring someone back from the brink of death, right? Was that a lie? Blade asked as he looked at Whistler's body in concern. Ezekiel's tone was steady and confident as he said, "No, it wasn't." Blade rummaged through the equipment on the ground as he looked for something to help Whistler as he said, "Whistler's dying. Can you help him? Do what you can to keep him stable. I'll be there soon." Ezekiel said, followed by a click. "What do you mean you'll be here soon? I haven't even told you where we are." "Hello? Hello?" Blade crushed the phone in his hand as he said, "That motherfucker hung up on me." Whistler coughed up some blood before he weakly said, "Settle down, kid." He coughed again before he said, "I think this is it, kid." Blade glanced down at Whistler's battered body before he said, "Don't talk, old man." Whistler sucked in a shaky, deep breath and tried to say something before he coughed up more blood. Blade gently reached over and touched his shoulder lightly as he said, "Just save your strength." As Blade pulled out a morphine injector from his own pack, a portal of light opened up in front of him. Blade quickly drew his gun, but as the portal fully opened up, he saw Ezekiel standing on the other side with a few other people. Before he could do anything, two women appeared kneeling next to Whistler as a green light shot out of their hands. Blade glanced at the women for a moment as Ezekiel said, "They are going to stabilize him while we move him." Ezekiel and two other people stepped through the portal with a stretcher before Ezekiel said, "Help us load him on the stretcher." Within a few moments, Whistler was loaded up on the stretcher, and everyone moved back through the portal, including Blade. They quickly moved into some kind of medical facility from what Blade could tell, and took Whistler into an emergency room. As Blade went to enter the room himself, Ezekiel grabbed his shoulder and said, "Just let them work. You'll only get in the way." Blade glanced at the doors to surgery for a few moments before he said, "Be honest. Will they be able to save him?" At this point, most likely. But with his missing limbs, I think his vampire hunting career is over. Ezekiel said. Blade frowned as he asked, "Can you send me back to where you found us?" "Sure," Ezekiel said. As they started to walk back to the portal room, Ezekiel asked, "What are you planning to do?" "Hunt down more vampires," Blade said in a cold tone. "Want some help?" Blade studied Ezekiel for a few moments before he asked, "Have you ever fought a vampire before?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Nope, but I'm a fast learner." "Then I'll give you the crash course on vampires then. First off, forget everything you learned from movies and stories about vampires," Blade said. "Vampires are stronger and faster than humans. With you being enhanced, they shouldn't give you many issues though," Blade said after a moment of thought. Blade pulled out a pistol and a couple of magazines before he handed it to Ezekiel as he said, "Take this. It's loaded with silver bullets blessed by a priest. They work better than regular silver bullets on most vampires." Blade then tapped the middle of his chest as he said, "Best place to aim is for the heart in the middle of the chest. A headshot can also work on lesser vampires or stun the more powerful ones. But unless you see them dissolve into ash, they aren't dead." Ezekiel looked over the modified 45 Hong Kong dollars tactical he was given for a moment before he pulled back the slide to see that a round was already chambered. He then checked to make sure the safety was on before he placed it and the extra magazines over a seal he wore on his arm. Once it was all sealed away, he asked, "Do you have a cold weapon I can use?" Blade glanced at the seal Ezekiel just used before he unstrapped a knife with a foot-long blade from his gear and handed it to Ezekiel still in the sheath. Ezekiel slid the knife out of the sheath and saw that it was made of silver and inscribed with religious markings as Blade said, "You can use this, but I want it back." As they walked into the portal room, Blade said, "A cold weapon only works if you stab them in the heart directly or sever their head. But never let your guard down till they turn into ash." After Ezekiel and Blade stepped out of the portal and it closed behind them, Blade said, "You also need to be aware of familiars. They're humans who work with vampires, so don't be afraid to kill them." "What if there's a victim that's being fed upon?" Ezekiel asked. Blade shook his head as he said, "If they've already been bitten, it's best to put them out of their misery before they turn." Blade glanced down at the blood on the ground from where Whistler was not long ago as Ezekiel asked, "You haven't figured out a cure for them?" Blade pulled out his gun and held it up as he said, "This is the cure." Blade then moved out of the room they were in and into a hallway as Ezekiel followed along and asked, "What if Whistler's infected?" Blade stopped in his tracks and glanced back at Ezekiel as he said, We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Now enough talk. Just follow me and watch your back." Ezekiel stopped talking and carefully followed along behind Blade for the next little while as he moved through the basement of a warehouse. Unfortunately, they didn't find any vampires. It seemed like the ones who were there all took off or were killed already. Since it was cleared, Blade led Ezekiel out of the building and down a couple blocks to his 1968 matte black Dodge Charger. Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Nice ride. I didn't see this when I was at your hideout." As they entered the car, Blade said, "It was in the back of the warehouse being worked on." "So now what?" Ezekiel asked as Blade started up the car. "We're going to another place that should be a vampire nest," Blade said as the car took off down the road. In the half hour it took for them to arrive near their next destination, Blade hadn't spoken a word. While Ezekiel wanted to chat with him, he figured it would be best to let Blade be for now, since the man seemed to be brooding. After they arrived, Blade parked his car on a side street before he said, "We'll walk from here, but be alert. They normally have watchers stationed a block or more out from the main nest." "Are watchers easy to spot?" Blade nodded his head as he said, "They tend to stand out when you know what to look for, but they'll most likely look like normal humans to you." Ezekiel glanced around the area they were in, which was surrounded by apartment buildings, before he asked, "Wouldn't it be better to approach from the rooftops and scout the place out first? Be my guest if you want to go up there, but I won't be able to watch your back if you do," Blade said. Ezekiel placed his hand over the seal he wore and pulled out two slim comm units. He placed one in his ear and handed the other one to Blade as he said, "All right, I'll head up top and scout from there." As they came to an alleyway, Ezekiel moved into it and then ran up the side of the building. Once on top, he took in the surroundings before he lightly said, "This rooftop is clear. I'm moving ahead to scout." As Ezekiel's body flickered to the next rooftop, Blade said from the comm unit, "The nest should be 3 blocks south of here. Just look for the only building with the windows blacked out." "Copy that. What should we expect to encounter from this nest?" Ezekiel asked as he quickly moved over the rooftops, leaving after images. Blade himself quickly moved through alleyways and side streets as he said, "A nest will typically have around 30 vampires and maybe 20 familiars. 10 of them will normally act as watchers at night." As Ezekiel came to the end of the block, he sped up and easily cleared the 100-foot gap to the building across the street and kept moving. Blade, who was a little bit behind him on the ground, saw the jump and said, "Impressive, but you'll draw attention if you do that closer to the nest." "I'll keep that in mind," Ezekiel said as he flickered to another rooftop and spotted a couple people in the distance talking on the rooftop of the last building at the end of the block. He stopped moving and hid behind a water tower before he quickly conjured a viewing spell to see the people up close. As Ezekiel studied the people on the roof, he said, "I found a couple people at the end of the block. They're chatting and look to be keeping watch of the area from the rooftop." 2. A watcher normally works alone. "Give me a moment. I'll be up in a minute," Blade said before Ezekiel opened a portal right in front of him. Blade stepped forward through the portal, and as it snapped closed behind him, he said, "That's a useful skill." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "I've yet to find a magic spell that wasn't useful." "Magic? Like turning flowers into doves and shit? That stuff's real?" Blade asked. "Yes, but real magic is made to be useful, like that," Ezekiel said as he pointed at the viewing spell behind Blade. Blade turned around and after a few seconds said, "Magic is definitely useful. Those are vampires, all right." Ezekiel chanted a little, while he moved his hands and the viewing spell zoomed out and changed to more of a top-down view. With the new angle and distance, they could see an overview of the whole block now. After they studied it for a few minutes, Ezekiel said, "There's at least 60 people acting as watchers." Blade frowned as he said, "Normally they don't gather in these types of numbers." Blade pointed at the building with the blacked-out windows as he asked, "Can you look inside that building?" "Give me a moment," Ezekiel said before he chanted a little and moved his hands around slightly. The view changed and zoomed in on the building in question before it showed the top floor. Over the next 10 minutes, the spell slowly showed the inside of the whole building, going through every room on every floor of the building. Once it was done, Ezekiel said, "All right, that's a lot of vampires." Blade nodded in agreement before he said, "Normally the main nest is under the building, but for some reason, it looks like they are all living in the building itself." Okay, but there were easily a few hundred in that building. You said a normal nest is like 50, so something weird must be going on here. How are we going to deal with them all? Ezekiel asked. Easy, we kill them. 00136. Calling for backup. I don't want to discredit your skills or mine, but how about we call for some backup? Ezekiel asked. Blade raised an eyebrow as he asked, and where are you going to find backup to fight vampires? Ezekiel smiled as he said, give me half an hour. Fine, but I'll start picking them off if you don't have backup by then. Blade said. Ezekiel cast a spell around them, then used his seal and pulled out his tablet before he started to type on it. A few messages were sent off as he asked, do you have extra ammo and cold weapons to fight vampires with at your hideout? We have silver stakes, a couple knives, and a few hundred rounds for 45 caliber guns. Why? Ezekiel quickly opened a portal up to Blade's hideout as he said, go get it, the backup will need it. Blade glanced at Ezekiel's tablet for a moment before he left through the portal. About 5 minutes later, he came out with a large backpack on and carried a large ammo case in his arms. As he set everything down, he said, that's all our current supplies. Ezekiel nodded and closed the portal before he said, it should be enough for everyone. Let me call someone really fast. Ezekiel then typed on his tablet, and a few moments later a click was heard in their comm unit as he asked, Master, would any of the sorcerers be interested in hunting some vampires? Blade heard a young woman's voice over his earpiece as she asked, you found vampires? Kinda. I found someone who hunts them and I am helping them out with a large nest. Ezekiel said, how large of a nest? The voice asked, a few hundred, maybe more. There was a pause before the voice said, that's a lot more than a large nest. That might be a vampire lord. Contact Mordo and Caecilius. Tell them to bring a sealing team. Blade glanced at Ezekiel as he asked, what's a sealing team? The voice said, they're a group of sorcerers who specialize in sealing off areas so demons can't escape. With them containing the vampires, it should lower human casualties to a minimum. Wait, demons are real? Blade asked. Blade heard a light chuckle before the voice asked, you hunt vampires and don't know about demons? What are you, some kind of amateur? Blade scowled as he said, I'm no amateur. I've hunted vampires for over 20 years. Still an amateur. The voice said. Before Blade could reply, Ezekiel said, thanks for the help, Master. Before he hung up the call, Blade gritted his teeth for a moment before he asked, who was that? Ezekiel shook his head and his whole body shivered a little as he said, that was my master, and she is someone you don't want to piss off. Trust me, I don't want to piss her off. She called me an amateur at hunting vampires. Blade said with a snarl. Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, well, she's closing in on 900 years old, so you're an amateur compared to her. Or a baby if we're being honest. No one lives that long. Is she even human? Blade asked as Ezekiel sent out more messages on his tablet. Once finished, Ezekiel looked up at Blade and said, she's human and she's been alive this long because of magic. Maybe I should learn magic, Blade said. Ezekiel nodded as he said, it takes a lot of study, practice, and skill, but it's worth it just for the portals alone. Ezekiel's tablet pinged a few times, which made him look down at it before he raised a hand and made a portal. After the portal fully opened, a group of armored women with swords stepped out of the portal, followed by a couple other people in tactical gear. Ezekiel smiled as he said, glad you accepted the invite. Sanhilda reached out and gripped Ezekiel's arm in a Viking-style handshake as she said, it's been a while since I've had a good fight. Well, hopefully vampires give you a challenge, Ezekiel said as they stopped shaking hands. Ezekiel glanced at the people in tactical gear as he said, I'm surprised you wanted to join in on this. Alexei smiled as he said, Melina wanted to see what a vampire looked like in person. Melina slapped Alexei's arm, who smiled wider as he said, I forgot she didn't want me to tell you that, ha ha ha. Ezekiel shook his head before he looked at the last person and said, tired of cooking? Jarvis nodded as he said, it's been a while since I went on a mission and this sounded fun. Blade glanced over the new people as they talked to Ezekiel before he said, I hope you're enhanced like Ezekiel, otherwise fighting vampires will be anything but fun. Ezekiel smirked as he said, don't worry, everyone I invited should be able to match a vampire in strength and speed. Maybe. By the way, This is Blade. Blade, this is Melina and her husband Alexei. This is Jarvis. While those lovely ladies are Valkyries, and that is Sandhilder, their leader. Ezekiel said as he pointed to each person. Ezekiel pointed to the backpack and ammo crate on the ground as he said, Blade was nice enough to supply us with weapons and ammo to fight vampires. So make sure you collect some while we wait on the others. Jarvis, Melina, and Alexei all moved to the ammo crate and started to load up the magazines they brought for their weapons. Since Blade only brought .45 caliber ammo, Ezekiel made sure everyone only brought guns that fired that type of round. Each of them had at least one handgun and a Chris Vector for their main weapon. Well, Alexei also had a collapsible shield and Melina had at least 6 knives strapped to her body that Ezekiel could see. As they worked on loading their weapons, Ezekiel glanced at Sandhilder and said, I know you don't like guns, but you should grab some silver weapons. Sandhilder shook her head and said, Our swords will be enough. Vampires can only be hurt by silver and sunlight. Garlic will also hurt them, but only if it enters their body, so I don't use it most of the time. Blade said. Sandhilder pulled out her sword and showed it to Blade as she said, This sword is made of URU and blessed with Asgardian magic. It should have no issue killing a lowly vampire when it's been used to slay gods. Blade glanced between the sword, Sandhilder, and then Ezekiel before he asked, That's a joke, right? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, Nope. Sandhilder and the other Valkyries never lie. It's a sacred honor-based thing for them. That being said, she was talking about a god with maybe only the G capitalized. Ezekiel said as he shrugged. Blade looked like he was about to say something before he shook his head. He didn't care to argue about a god still being a god. Ezekiel smirked before he checked his tablet again and typed some more on it. After that, everyone just double-checked their gear as they waited for Mordo's group to arrive. It was close to the 30-minute deadline Ezekiel set when a portal opened next to them and out stepped Mordo, Kaisalius, Wong, and 9 other sorcerers. Ezekiel smiled and turned to Blade as he said, Blade, this is Mordo, Kaisalius, and Wong. Ezekiel glanced at the other sorcerers as he said, We haven't met yet. I'm Ezekiel. It took about a minute for everyone to introduce themselves to each other before Mordo glanced at Ezekiel and asked, Where's the nest at? Ezekiel pointed towards the south as he said, 2 blocks that way with the blacked-out windows. There's also 50-plus vampires spread out around a 2-block area that are keeping watch. Ezekiel casted the viewing spell again and set it up so everyone could see all the vampires currently outside of the building. After examining it for a few minutes, Mordo said, We'll need to take out all the sentries before Wong and his sealing team can lock down that building. As Ezekiel and the others discussed a plan to take out the guards, Blade watched quietly. At first, he was upset at Ezekiel taking the lead, but his better judgment and the fact Ezekiel's people were helping Whistler stopped him from speaking up. He was also surprised as he listened to them come up with a simple plan to dispatch all the guards. As they finished up, Ezekiel glanced at Blade as he asked, What do you think? Blade was surprised again since he didn't think Ezekiel would ask for his opinion on the matter. After a few moments, Blade said, I'm not completely sure if it will work like you said, but we can give it a try. Ezekiel then turned to Mordo and asked, Where do you want to set it up? You've already placed a concealment spell here, so we'll just do it here. Mordo said before he started to set up all the other sorcerers. Each one stood a few feet apart in a line. Next, Sandhilder and the Valkyries lined up across from them with their swords drawn. It left a 6-foot gap in the middle of where they stood. After that, Mordo used a spell to highlight all the different vampires on Ezekiel's viewing spell. All the vampires were marked, which gave every sorcerer at least 5 targets. Once everything was set, Mordo said, Target the outer groups first. Ezekiel and the others tensed up slightly in case something went wrong as the sorcerers all made a portal at the same time. The portal wasn't normal, though, and opened up horizontally above them, right between where they stood with the Valkyries. As soon as the portals opened, 10 vampires dropped through the portal. Before they even knew what happened, the Valkyries all cleaved through their necks. In one swift and efficient motion, their heads were detached before they burst into flames, dissolving into ash and bone fragments. Before the first group of vampires were completely gone, another portal opened up and another group of vampires dropped down into the remains of the last. With another fluid motion, the Valkyries dispatched the next set of vampires and within less than a minute, all of the outside guards were destroyed. Ezekiel couldn't help but smile. Mordo's plan worked perfectly. He turned to see Blade give Mordo a nod of respect before Mordo said, "All right, let's move to stage 2. Mordo, Kaisalius, Wong, and the other sorcerers nodded as they each made a portal to the building that acted as a vampire's nest. Ezekiel made his own portal and let everyone through it as he stored away the backpack and ammo case Blade brought over into his storage seal. Before he stepped through the portal and it snapped closed behind him, on the roof Wong and the other sorcerers quickly set up a shielding array before they sat in the middle of it. Once inside, they channeled some universal energy into the array, which created an orange shield around the group. After that, Wong started a chant, and one person would join in on the chant after the first chant was finished. It seemed to not work at first, but Ezekiel could feel the magic as it pulsated from the group. As each new person joined the chant, it became more powerful. Just before the last person joined in on the chanting, Blade and the others not gifted in magic could feel the power as it pulsated from the spell. A moment later, the roof access door flung open as a couple of vampires came out to see what was going on, as even they could feel the pulse of magic. A couple of them hissed at the group gathered on the roof before one of them noticed Blade and yelled out, "Daywalker!" The next second, the area around them seemed to be sucked towards the barrier. Wong and his group were chanting inside, before the area around the whole building seemed to break like glass. Everyone not used to entering the mirror dimension, including the vampires, stared at the weird sight for a moment in shock before a gunshot rang out. Everyone turned to see Ezekiel with a gun in his hand in front of the vampire, who just yelled out. As the vampire burst into flames, Ezekiel said, "I came to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and I'm all out of bubblegum," before he shot the other two vampires in the heart. 00137. That's one way to do it. Did you really just quote, "They live"? Blade asked. Ezekiel smiled as he said, "What? It's a classic," before he mumbled to himself, "Maybe I should have saved it in case the scrolls tried to invade." Ezekiel quickly shook his head before he said, "What are you all standing around for? We have vampires to hunt." "Kaisalius, you're with me. Blade, you group up with Mordo. Alexei and Melina are already a team, so that leaves Jarvis with." Ezekiel glanced at Sanhilder and the 10 Valkyries she bought and asked, "Sanhilder, will you partner up with Jarvis?" Sanhilder nodded before she split up the other Valkyries into groups of 2. As they finished, more vampires rushed out of the stairwell. This time, a few of them carried guns and immediately opened fire on the group. A magic shield flickered to life as the bullets slammed into it, saving the group. Ezekiel glanced at Kaisalius, who nodded at him with one hand raised in the air. Kaisalius then quickly chanted a spell, and with his other hand a red-colored whip appeared, which he swung at the group of vampires on the roof. The whip split them all in half at the waist but didn't kill them, so Ezekiel quickly moved towards them and shot around through each of their hearts. As all of them but one started dissolving away, Ezekiel glanced at the man as he said, "Looks like he wasn't a vampire." Blade walked close to the man's body and lifted his hand up to show a tattoo. He glanced at it for just a moment before he showed it to everyone else and said, "This is a familiar mark. If you find normal humans running around inside, they're most likely a vampire familiar. Don't hesitate to kill them." "What if they aren't running around, or they look like a victim?" Jarvis asked. "I would suggest not wasting time with anyone you think is a victim. Just knock them out and tie them up. We can sort them out after we deal with the vampires," Blade said. Ezekiel glanced at the group as he said, "Stay with your teammate and watch each other's backs. I'm going to head to the ground floor with Kaisalius and clear it out before going into the basement." Ezekiel glanced at Kaisalius and said, "Have a shield ready as I make the portal." Kaisalius nodded and created another shield before Ezekiel opened up a portal to the street below as Blade said, "Me and Mordo should join you. The basement will have a heavier concentration of vampires." Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "Be my guest." Kaisalius moved through the portal with his shield up before Blade and Mordo followed behind him. As Ezekiel stepped through the portal, he glanced back and said, "I'll try not to bring down the building." After the portal snapped closed, Jarvis asked, "That was a joke, right?" Down on the street below, Ezekiel said, "Stay behind the shield. I'll get the door." He then sucked in a lot of air quickly as he made some hand signs before he breathed out as he said, "Katon. Gokaku no Jutsu. Flames shot out of Ezekiel's mouth, which formed a fireball about 15 feet in diameter before it flew towards the main entrance of the building. As the other group on the roof moved towards the roof stairwell access, Alexei patted Jarvis's shoulder as he said, "It's Ezekiel. He always jokes around." Everyone felt a substantial rush of heat before a massive explosion rocked the whole building and caused it to shake under their feet. Jarvis and the others looked at Alexei, who rubbed the back of his head and said, "Okay, maybe not." Down on the street, Blade looked at the massive hole in the front of the building that went up to the third floor, along with the fire now surrounding it as he asked, "Was that magic too?" Ezekiel flexed his right arm as he said, "That was all me, 100% natural, baby." Mordo and Kaiselius shared a look before they ignored Ezekiel and moved towards the hole in the front of the building. Blade decided to ignore Ezekiel also and moved to follow the others as Ezekiel asked, "What?" "It's true." Mordo turned to Blade and said, "The Ancient One told us it's best to ignore him when he gets like this. Otherwise, it just encourages him to do it more." Kaiselius nodded his head in agreement as Blade asked, "Is the Ancient One the person Ezekiel calls master?" Ezekiel caught up to them and said, "Yup, and she likes to spoil my fun." As they closed in on the hole, a couple vampires ran out of the building screaming since they were on fire. Blade didn't hesitate and quickly shot them before he said, "That fire might be an issue if we don't put it out." Mordo nodded in agreement before he said, "I'll handle it." Kaiselius kept his shield up as the group stopped at the edge of the fire, and Mordo started to cast a spell. As he chanted, all the fire started to pull back as it gathered together, and within seconds it was just a small ball of flames before it winked out. Afterwards, the group walked into the building through the hole and started to clear the first floor. Up on the top floor, Alexei acted as the group's vanguard with his shield as Melina shot anyone who had a gun. Since they had such a large group, instead of people splitting off and running ahead to other floors, Alexei and Melina stayed in the main hallway, while one of the groups would enter an apartment to clear it. It worked out pretty well since the Valkyries had so many years of experience together. Jarvis and Sandhilder also worked well together and didn't run into any issues. The vampires in the building were split on what to do since they heard fighting from the top floor and the first floor. Most of them ended up moving lower towards the explosion, but at least 100 moved towards the top floor. Alexei, who stood in the middle of the hallway, saw the influx of vampires coming into the hallway from the stairwell and ran his finger over a rune on the inside of his shield. The shield pulsed with magic energy before a magic shield popped open to cover the hallway directly in front of it. As bullet fire slammed into the magic shield, Alexei laughed as he said, "I love this shield." Melina, who stood next to Alexei, took aim and shot a couple vampires through the heart before she said, "I'm glad. But how about you help thin the herd?" "Sorry, my love," Alexei said as he pulled out his own gun and sprayed it into the horde of vampires coming down the hallway. "They're vampires. You need to aim, you oaf," Melina said in annoyance as she took out 3 more vampires with clean shots through their heads. As the large swarm moved closer, Sandhilder and Jarvis exited the apartment they just cleared. Sandhilder noticed the group and smiled before she charged forward as she said, "Move. I'll take care of them." Alexei turned slightly so Sandhilder could run past, and a moment later, she slammed into the front of the incoming vampires horde with glee. Within moments, she was in the thick of them as she laughed with abandon and chopped off body parts with ease. As the others watched, Melina said, "And I thought that Madara guy was a battle maniac." Before anyone could reply, 2 Valkyries ran past them and joined the fray. Before long, all of the women were laughing as they cut down the stream of vampires coming up the stairs. Within a few minutes, all of the Valkyries were in the cramped hallway killing vampires as they laughed with glee. Alexei glanced at his wife and asked, "I don't think we're needed here." Melina nodded in agreement before Jarvis said, "How about we clear out the other apartments as they have fun?" Back downstairs, Blade would be lying if he said he wasn't impressed with Ezekiel and the people he brought with him. They cleared out the first floor in minutes and were now fighting the swarm of vampires that flooded down from the floors above. Mordo and Kaiselius were together near the stairwell and acted as a funnel to help thin out the swarm as it moved towards Ezekiel. Ezekiel stood alone in the middle of the hallway and only used the knife Blade gave him earlier. With quick and efficient moves, he cut down every vampire that moved close to him, while Blade covered the other end of the hallway near the hole Ezekiel made as some vampires were jumping down from the second and third story of the building. As they fought, Ezekiel asked Blade over the sound of battle, "Is this what normally happens when you attack a nest?" "No, this is anything but normal. I've never seen vampires act like this before," Blade said before he shot another vampire. Mordo, who just sliced a vampire in half with a conjured sword, said, "They are honestly acting more like zombies than vampires. It's like their only concern is getting to us at any cost." Ezekiel killed a few more vampires before he asked, "What would be able to control vampires like this?" Caecilius crushed a group of vampires into paste with a spell before he said, "It could be a greater vampire, but with this amount of mindless vampire thralls, it's most likely a vampire lord, and it should be somewhere below this building." Vampire lord? What the hell is that? I've only fought lesser vampires and greater vampires before, Blade said. Vampire lords are powerful vampires who have lived for at least 1,000 years or more. But their main threat is normally from the horde of vampires they use to protect themselves with. We should still be cautious when we face them, though, since they are powerful in their own right, Caecilius said. Ezekiel killed another vampire as he asked, "So should we wait for the others once we finish here?" Caecilius shrugged as he conjured a sword and used it to slice down a vampire before he said, "We won't really need them. Plus, depending on where the Lord is, we might have too many people to properly fight them." Blade moved closer to Ezekiel so he could reload as he asked, "Won't a bullet to the heart kill them?" "Possibly, but vampire lords can become immune to silver and garlic if they live long enough. The best thing to do is to restrain them and kill them with sunlight," Caecilius said. After that, they continued to fight off the vampires until the swarm trickled down to almost nothing. Then they went around and killed any vampire that didn't dissolve. As they were almost finished, Sanhilder and the rest of the upstairs group joined them. While Alexei, Melina, and Jarvis looked pretty much clean, Sanhilder and the other Valkyries were completely covered in grime. Ezekiel glanced at the women for a moment who were covered in blood, ash, and dirt before he asked, "What the hell happened to you guys?" 00138, the Vampire Lord. After a quick chat, Ezekiel used a cleaning spell to help out the Valkyries, since they were the only ones who were dirty before he said, "Double-check the building and see if we missed anything, while my group is going to head downstairs and look for the vampire boss." "I would like to join if that's possible," Sanhilder said. Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "It will be a little cramped, but be my guest." As the others went back upstairs to double-check the building, Ezekiel and his group moved towards the stairs leading to the basement. Caecilius took the lead as he erected a shield in front of himself as he headed down the stairs. At first, it seemed somewhat normal, but after they reached the bottom of the stairs, the temperature dropped slightly and the stairwell light seemed to be dimmer. As they looked at the door leading deeper into the basement, Ezekiel glanced at Caecilius as he asked, "Is this normal for a vampire lord?" Caecilius chuckled before he said, "No idea. I never finished the book on vampires. It was a little too boring of a read." Ezekiel looked at Mordo as he asked, "What about you?" "No clue. My focus of study is on magic creation and demons." Ezekiel thought about calling Tao, but he knew he would get an unwanted lecture or possibly extra training. Ezekiel wasn't stupid enough to do that, so he said, "Mordo, give us some magic light, and then we'll break down that door." After Mordo casted a perpetual light spell around the group, he conjured a magic sword and signaled he was ready. Ezekiel moved towards the door and placed some directional explosive tags with a time delay around it before he stepped back and said, "Cover your ears." A few seconds later, an explosion rocked the room, with all of the force going into the doorway leading deeper into the basement. The doorway and wall surrounding it were completely gone, and the only thing that could be seen beyond the now gaping hole was darkness. Caecilius started to advance first, and as he passed through the hole, the room in front of him lit up slightly. It looked like a normal apartment building basement with one exception. A large hole rested in the middle of the room. As the group moved closer to the hole, the colder the temperature dropped. Once they were by the edge of the hole, Ezekiel pulled out some glow sticks from his storage seal. After he activated them, he tossed them down the hole, only for them to disappear once they were out of range of Mordo's light spell. Ezekiel shared a glance with the others before he asked, "What do you think?" "I don't sense any magic. Maybe it's an innate ability of the vampire," Mordo said. Caecilius nodded in agreement before he said, "It would explain the temperature difference as well." Ezekiel glanced down into the hole for a few moments before he said, "I'll construct a platform to take us down." As Ezekiel started to weave a spell together, Caecilius decided to cast his own perpetual light spell, which helped to push back the darkness a little further. When Ezekiel finished his spell, a flat magical construct floated over the hole. He glanced at the others before he stepped on it and said, "Let's see just how deep this rabbit hole goes." As everyone else stepped onto the platform, Blade asked, "Does he always quote movies?" Caecilius and Mordo both nodded as Sanhilder said, "I'm not sure. I haven't watched any Midgardian entertainment myself." As Ezekiel lowered the platform down into the darkness of the pit below them, he looked at Sanhilder and asked, "Why not? You've been on Earth for over half a year. You should have watched something by now." "What do you mean she's been on Earth for half a year?" Blade asked as his right eyebrow raised. "I told you she was the leader of the Valkyries when I introduced you to each other. Plus, she mentioned her weapon and killing gods." Blade frowned as he said, "I thought that was some kind of team name. As for the comment about her weapon and killing gods, I thought it was a joke." "Oh, I guess that kind of makes sense now that I think about it," Ezekiel said as he nodded to himself. Ezekiel pointed at Sanhilder as he said, "Blade, this is Sanhilder, former Asgardian warrior and leader of the Valkyries from Nordic folklore. All the legends you might have heard about them are based on her and the other Valkyries." Blade looked unconvinced as he said, "That would make her over 1,000 years old at least. I am over 7,000 years old, unless you count the time I was dead, which would make me closer to 10,000. Sanhilder said. Blade looked at everyone for a few moments, and when he realized no one seemed to be joking, he said to Ezekiel, "We're going to need to talk after this." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "That's fine, but let's wait for Whistler to be better, since I don't want to explain stuff twice." Ezekiel then glanced back at Sanhilder and said, "After we're finished here, I'm taking everyone to eat breakfast, and then I am making you and all the other Valkyries watch Yojimbo." A moment later, the hole they were traveling down opened up into a larger area. They still had limited vision though, since the two light spells only helped so much. As the spell construct touched the ground, Ezekiel said in a joking tone of voice, "Lady and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I would like to." Mordo slapped Ezekiel in the back of the head before he said, "Tao said if you get too distracted, that hitting you should fix the problem." "Did it work?" Mordo asked as he smiled. Ezekiel shot Mordo a glare as he said, "You and Tao need to loosen up." Blade slowly pulled out his sword as he said, "I don't want to interrupt your moment, but we have company." Sanhilder, with her sword already drawn, said, "I also sense something." Ezekiel and the rest of the group tensed up slightly as they looked around at the inky black void surrounding them. With the magic light which only covered about 20 feet around them, they couldn't even see the hole above them. After almost a minute, when nothing happened, Ezekiel asked, "Are you sure something is?" At that moment, a vampire jumped out of the darkness and slammed into the magic shield. "I retract my earlier question." As the vampire clawed at the shield, Ezekiel said, "You know, I kinda thought there would be more than one of them." As Ezekiel finished talking, a whole swarm of vampires charged out of the darkness and slammed into the shield from all sides. While Caecilius concentrated on adding more power to the shield, Ezekiel slammed his right fist into his other hand as he said, "Found them." After Mordo created his own barrier to help Caecilius. He glanced at Ezekiel and asked, "Can you take this more seriously?" Blade nodded in agreement as he shot into the mass of vampires surrounding them, while Sanhilder used her sword from inside the safety of the barrier. Ezekiel started to slowly do hand signs as he asked, "Do either of the barriers protect against heat?" "No," Mordo and Caecilius said at the same time. "Then make one. It's about to get a lot hotter." Mordo started to cast another spell as Ezekiel took a deep breath and raised his hands to his mouth. Right as a new barrier appeared around them, Ezekiel said, "Katan, Goka Mekyaku." A torrent of fire quickly spread from Ezekiel's mouth and engulfed the vampires in front of him, while it also lit up more of the place they were in. As Ezekiel sprayed fire over the vampires, the others moved around with him, so he could cover the whole area in fire. As he finished, the group could finally see that they were actually in a cave system. Ezekiel looked around at his work as he dusted his hands off before he looked at Mordo as he asked, "Happy?" "No. You play around too much. I honestly have no idea why the Ancient One even wastes her time teaching you," Mordo said as he frowned. Ezekiel took a moment to study Mordo before he smirked and asked, "Is that jealousy I hear? If you like Tao so much, just ask her out." "I." Mordo turned directly towards Ezekiel with a glare before he said, "This is exactly what I am talking about. We are in a dangerous situation, and you would rather act like a child than take it seriously." Mordo narrowed his eyes as he said, "Take this seriously or I'm leaving." Ezekiel wanted to argue back, but after seeing the others nodding in agreement with Mordo, he raised his arms in the air as he said, "Fine, I'll be good." Instead of making sure the vampires were properly killed, the group moved past them and went deeper into the cave system. Before the darkness overtook them again, Mordo casted another light spell, but this one expanded out past the old ones. It helped them to see about 50 feet ahead of themselves as they headed deeper underground. They ended up not running into any more vampires along the way, but a couple times they ran into splits in the tunnel system. Instead of checking each one, Blade pointed them down a certain path. When asked why, he said he could smell a heavy scent of blood from that direction. The constant temperature drop as they went deeper also helped at first, but after a while the temperature stayed consistent and didn't drop anymore. After some time passed, the cave tunnel opened up to a large chamber, the opposite end of which was filled with medical equipment and large test tubes that looked like the ones Theo's team used for cloning bodies. Towards the left side were cages with a handful of people inside, while in front of the cages rested 5 tables. On each of the tables were corpses in different stages of being dissected. The right side of the room looked like a study of some sort, with a large amount of bookcases that were behind a desk and chair. To the left side of that study area was a coffin, and to the right of it was a pool of blood, carved out of the bedrock. After they looked around the room for a few moments, Ezekiel asked, "Maybe the vampire lord is asleep in their coffin? I rarely use my coffin down here," a voice said from behind the bookcases. Everyone tensed up as a blonde-haired young man walked out from behind one of the bookcases with a book in his hands as he read from it. He moved to the desk before he placed a bookmark inside the book and set it down on the desk. When he looked up from the book, his golden eyes took everyone in before he said, "Well, this is a surprise." The man slowly walked around the desk as he said, "From the information I gathered, the Daywalker should only have an old man as his companion, a man named Whistler." The vampire stopped walking after he cleared the desk as he asked, "Which raises a question. Who are these new friends you have, Daywalker?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "It's quite rude to ask for a person's name and not introduce yourself first." "Oh, my apologies. I am." Ezekiel cut the man off as he said, "I'm Ezekiel, 76 years old. My zodiac sign is Cancer. My favorite food is pancakes. My hobbies are go-karts and programming." Ezekiel then quickly pointed at the others as he said with a smirk, "This is Kaiselius. The unhappy-looking guy is Mordo. That is Sanhilder, and of course you know the other unhappy-looking guy is Daywalker. We just call him Blade. 00139. How not to fight a vampire lord?" The blonde-haired vampire tilted his head slightly as he asked, "Are you trying to piss me off?" "Maybe. Is it working?" Ezekiel asked with a smirk. "No, you would have to try harder than that. Now, like I said before I was interrupted, my name is..." A gunshot rang out as a silver bullet slammed into the vampire's chest, and Ezekiel asked, "How about now?" The vampire glanced down at the small hole in his chest before he looked up with narrowed eyes and said, "You really are trying to piss me off." Ezekiel laughed before he asked, "Of course I am. I literally told you I was. Or do you not understand basic English?" The others all glanced at Ezekiel as the vampire held out his hand before the bullet in his chest came back out and dropped into it. He looked at it for a moment as he said, "You won't be able to hurt me with this." When the vampire tossed the bullet to the side, Ezekiel shot him in the same spot until he emptied the magazine in his gun before he asked, "Are you sure? We won't know unless we try, right?" The The vampire glanced at his chest before he started to walk towards the group as Ezekiel quickly casted a Jinjutsu on him. The vampire only frowned slightly before he said, "I'm not sure what you just tried to do, but it won't work on me. I can feel it. None of you are strong enough to hurt me." The vampire smiled and locked eyes with Ezekiel as he said, "I was just planning to kill you, since the Daywalker is the only one who will make a useful test subject." The vampire kept his gaze only on Ezekiel as he said, "But I changed my mind. I'm going to enjoy torturing all of you." Ezekiel chuckled again as he asked, "No thanks. How about I just kill you instead?" As the other people in his group prepared to fight, Ezekiel stored his gun away and pulled out the knife blade gave him early. The vampire creepily smiled as he said, "Nothing you brought will be able to hurt me. I've already evolved myself beyond a normal vampire. Let's test that out," Ezekiel said before he disappeared. Ezekiel reappeared behind the vampire who was almost next to the group and tried to plunge the knife into the vampire's heart. The vampire caught the blade with his hand as he said, "Interesting. You have incredible speed with subpar strength." The vampire ripped the blade from Ezekiel's grasp before he snapped it in half and tossed it to the side as he said, "I told you, you can't hurt me." Ezekiel touched the seal on his arm and pulled out a stack of explosive tags as he said, "If silver doesn't work, let's try paper instead." The next second, Ezekiel disappeared and attempted to cover the vampire in explosive tags. The vampire matched Ezekiel in speed and intercepted him every time he went to place a tag. Once Ezekiel was done, he reappeared in the middle of his group as the vampire looked at the tags in his hand. "And what did you hope to accomplish with these things?" Ezekiel smirked as he said, "Boom." The explosion that followed was massive, but was refocused back onto the main point of the explosion thanks to a special tag meant to contain explosions and redirect them. The tiny bit that wasn't contained was blocked by Mordo and Kaisalius' shield. As the smoke from the blast slowly cleared away, they were greeted by the blonde-haired vampire again. His clothes were completely ruined and his right hand was burned, but otherwise he looked fine. Ezekiel clicked his tongue as he said, "Looks like we'll have to restrain him and use the sun." The vampire glanced at his hand for a moment as it healed before he locked eyes with Ezekiel again and said, "I'm not just gonna torture you. I'll torture everyone you care about. I'll start with these people here before I find everyone blood related to you." Ezekiel frowned slightly as the vampire smiled and said, "Don't worry. I'll keep you alive the whole time. You'll be able to watch as the people you care about cry out in pain and blame you for their misery." The vampire pointed to the 5 tables on the other side of the room as he said, "As you can see, I have a lot of experience in keeping someone alive, while also in a constant state of pain. I can easily keep you alive for years as you watch what I do to your loved ones. You just don't know when to shut up, do you?" Ezekiel asked as he started to weave a spell together. The vampire smiled as he asked, "Am I pissing you off?" Ezekiel finished conjuring a magic sword before he attacked the vampire again. The vampire blocked the attack with his own arm as he said, "Are you stupid? I told you, you can't hurt me. Are you stupid? I'm not going to take your word for it," Ezekiel said as he turned into a blur and attacked the vampire. The vampire, for his part, easily kept up and parried every attack with his hand. As they fought, the rest of Ezekiel's group looked for a chance to help, but with the pair's current speed, they couldn't do much. As the others watched, Mordo said, "Let's prepare a restraining spell." Kaisalius nodded in agreement before he started to chant a spell with Mordo. As they worked on the spell, the vampire finally attacked back and attempted to hit Ezekiel. Ezekiel turned into a puff of smoke as a small rock appeared where he just was. Ezekiel himself attempted to attack the vampire from behind, but the vampire easily parried the blow away. Ezekiel retreated as he glanced at his group for a moment, which the vampire used as an opportunity to attack. The blow just missed Ezekiel, who was able to parry it in time. But the vampire didn't stop and pressed the attack on Ezekiel. Ezekiel did his best to fight back, but the vampire seemed to be slightly faster than him, and Ezekiel was mostly relying on his body flicker skill to move and attack. This was also Ezekiel's first real fight with someone, and he was outclassed by them in speed. Ezekiel knew the main issue was that his body still wasn't developed, so he lacked the ability to do any type of damage to the guy. But the guy was also a monster and healed a lot faster than a normal vampire should. Even then, Ezekiel wasn't losing by much, but he didn't really have a way to win either. After a few more moments of being pushed back, the spell Mordo and Caecilius were chanting finished. Red bands appeared next to the vampire and lashed around him, which locked him in place. The vampire glanced down at his body for a moment before he said, "You sorcerers are always a hassle to deal with." Ezekiel waved the conjured sword in his hand as he asked, "You know I'm a sorcerer too, right?" The vampire struggled against the spell for a few moments before he ripped his arms free, breaking the spell. He glanced at Ezekiel as he said, "You're not skilled enough to be a hassle." Instead of going after Ezekiel again, the vampire charged at Mordo and Caecilius. As he slammed into the first barrier, Mordo was forced to concentrate on the spell, otherwise it would break. Blade and Sanhilder used the opportunity to attack the vampire as he tried to break through the barrier. Both of them attacked with their swords, but only Sanhilder's sword caused any type of damage. The vampire didn't stop and barely noticed the small wound that healed almost instantly. As they attacked again, Mordo struggled to keep the barrier up while Caecilius casted a new spell to reinforce the barrier. Ezekiel used the opportunity to attack the vampire from behind, but was basically ignored. Sanhilder, who noticed her sword could damage the vampire, tried to target a more vital area. She attempted to plunge her sword into the vampire's chest as she aimed for its heart, but it was stopped before it could go too deep. The vampire, annoyed with the attack, stopped his attack on the shield for a moment before he grabbed Sanhilder's sword with both hands and ripped it free from her grasp. Afterwards, he glanced at the sword for a moment before he used it to renew his attack on the shield. With the help of the magic-infused sword, he easily broke the barrier in a few swings. Before he broke through the next barrier, which left the group defenseless. Once the other shield broke, Ezekiel realized they were in trouble and pulled out his tablet to send a message to Tao. As he did that, the vampire with his speed quickly subdued Blade and Sanhilder. After the message was sent, Ezekiel quickly casted a light spell and prepared himself to buy time as he watched the vampire take down Caecilius. As Ezekiel watched the fight and prepared another spell, he had a fleeting thought that he should make a portal so they could escape. But he quickly rejected the idea, as he knew he wouldn't be able to portal everyone else out if he attempted it. Plus, the vampire lord always seemed to be watching him and wasn't sure if he would get the spell off correctly. Sure, he could normally do a portal spell with no issue, but his adrenaline was pumping like crazy, and he was having a hard time casting anything at the moment. Mordo was the last one to fall because he had a few magic items that aided in his defense. But in a matter of a few seconds, all of them were laid out on the ground, leaving Ezekiel alone. Ezekiel glanced worriedly at everyone as the blonde-haired vampire turned around and said, "Don't worry, I didn't kill them." The vampire menacingly walked closer to Ezekiel as he said, "I already told you. I am going to torture you and everyone you care about." Ezekiel narrowed his eyes as he said, "Over my dead body." The vampire chuckled before he said, "Oh, you'll wish you were dead, but I won't let you die that easily." Ezekiel retreated towards the cavern entrance as he worked to buy more time for Tao to arrive. He made it to the entrance as the vampire caught up to him and forced him to stop. The vampire licked his lips, which showed off his fangs as he asked, "Trying to run away?" Ezekiel wanted to quip, but instead attacked the vampire head-on as he tried to move into the tunnel. Ezekiel couldn't slip past him, but he was able to force them away from the cavern and into the tunnel itself as they fought with each other. With Ezekiel's conjured magical sword versus the vampire's stolen Valkyrie blade. As they moved farther into the tunnel, Ezekiel counted the seconds in his head. He only needed a minute or two, and Tao would come to the rescue. 10 seconds, then 20, 30, 50, 70. The longer they fought, the harder it was for Ezekiel to match the vampire's speed. In fact, the vampire lord seemed to be increasing their speed. Right as Ezekiel realized the vampire lord was holding back, the vampire lord twisted his blade from a parry and sliced through Ezekiel's wrist that held his sword. At first, the vampire lord smiled as Ezekiel's hand fell off and his magic sword disappeared. But then he frowned when he didn't see any blood come out. As the hand on the ground faded away, Ezekiel's hand slowly reappeared on his wrist as if nothing happened. Ezekiel used the vampire's momentary pause to pull out 2 kunai from his storage seal and attacked. The vampire lazily blocked the attacks as he asked, "Interesting. Was that your own power or a magic spell?" When Ezekiel just continued to attack, the vampire said, "If you don't want to answer me, I'll just find out for myself." The vampire increased its speed again and sliced off both of Ezekiel's hands at the wrist this time. As the vampire watched, Ezekiel's whole body flickered for a moment before the vampire's eyes widened slightly. The next moment it swung its sword and sliced off Ezekiel's legs below the kneecap before it quickly chopped through the very top of Ezekiel's head. As Ezekiel's body fell to the ground, the hinge seal on his arm crumbled as it could no longer keep up with the damage. After the hinge faded away, Theo looked up at the vampire lord who towered in front of him. The vampire lord looked down on Theo with a frown as he asked, "I was taunted by a mere child?" Before Theo could respond, the vampire lord snatched him up by his neck with his free hand. As Theo struggled in the grip, the vampire brought him up to eye level and stared deeply into his eyes for a few moments before he said, "You truly are just a child." Theo couldn't really speak as the vampire gripped his throat, but that didn't stop him as he spit in the vampire's face. The vampire squeezed Theo's neck a little tighter as he said, "Just wait, child. We are going to have so much fun together." As Theo started to lose consciousness from the lack of oxygen, the vampire said, "First, I'm going to torture you, so I can find your family. Then I am going to make you watch as I torture them." As Theo's mind touched on the darkness of unconsciousness, thoughts flashed through his head of his family. His mom's tender smile, his father's goofy grin, the proud look his dad has whenever any of them accomplishes something, no matter how small it might be. How when Millie gets excited, she will call him Teo again instead of Theo. Or when his little brother Isaac asks him to read books together. As Theo fought against unconsciousness, his last thought was, "I'll never let someone hurt my family." The vampire lord watched as consciousness faded from the boy's eyes, and just as the light spell the boy cast began to dim, the boy's eyes started to spin as they turned red. 00140. Tao saves the day? After Theo's body hit the ground, he took a ragged breath as his body greedily sucked in air. As he gulped down another breath, he glanced around in confusion. It was completely dark, and he didn't know where he was at first. On his next breath, he regained some clarity and quickly stood up as he started to cast a barrier spell. After the barrier spell was in place, he then created a new light spell to see what was going on. As the space around him became illuminated, he took a step back. The vampire lord stood directly in front of him with a blank look on his face like he was under a genjutsu. Theo studied him for a few moments in confusion before a voice said, "I admit, I'm just as confused as you are. A vampire lord shouldn't be able to fall for one of your genjutsus. But whatever your eyes did overpowered them." "My eyes?" Theo asked as he turned around to see Tao, who nodded as she said, "Your eyes changed." Theo froze for a moment as he sensed the chakra flowing to his eyes, which he cut off, before he threw both arms in the air as he said, "My eyes changed?" Yes, your eyes changed. Congratulations. But you should really change back before someone else sees the real you," Tao said in an unimpressed tone of voice. Theo's eyes went wide for a moment before he hinged back into Ezekiel. Afterwards, he pulled out a seal and placed it on his arm. Once that was done, he glanced at Tao and asked, "What took you so long?" "That was easily 5 minutes or more." Tao smiled as she said, "I've been here since just after you called me early. I've watched everything you did to see where you currently lack so we can focus on it during training. Which reminds me." Tao flicked her hand and the vampire lifted into the air as she said, "Come along. We need to go back to the others." Ezekiel frowned before he pulled the sword from the vampire's hand and said, "If you've been here since the start, why didn't you help sooner? I could have died. It was an invaluable training experience for you and the others, one that you will never forget," Tao said with the hint of a smile before she added, "Besides, he wanted you alive." Ezekiel glanced at the vampire lord for a moment before he said, "That's true, but shouldn't you restrain him? I'm not sure how long that genjutsu will last." "It'll be fine. But you should probably summon a medical team to help Mordo and the others. They're alive, but pretty beat up." Tao said as they walked out of the tunnel into the cavern area the vampire used. Ezekiel paused to check his chakra reserve before he summoned shadow clones of Sakura and a few more medical nin from different villages. They rushed over to the others and started to work on them. Luckily, like Tao said, they were banged up but had no life-threatening injuries. The vampire in his haste only subdued them before he knocked them out. So within a couple of minutes, all of them were back up and on their feet. After everyone was up, Ezekiel told the medical nin to go check on the people in the cages. Before he handed Sanhilder her sword back and said, "Sorry about that. I honestly didn't think he would be that powerful." It's fine, as a warrior. Fighting a strong opponent is a great honor and helps to test your skills. Unfortunately, my skills are currently lacking since I haven't adjusted to this body, Sanhilder said with a smile. Mordo frowned slightly as he pointed a finger at Ezekiel and said in a raised tone of voice, I told you to stop joking around. If the Ancient One didn't show up, we all could have died because of your foolish actions." Ezekiel raised both arms in the air as he said, "Let's just chill out for a moment and think about what he said. He planned to kill us from the start. It was only because of me that he didn't. If anything, I kinda saved our lives. That doesn't make it any better. I told you before, don't goof off and take this seriously," Mordo said as he glared at Ezekiel. Caecilius nodded in agreement before he said, "While it's good no one was seriously hurt, you need to take things more seriously when facing any opponent. Especially an unknown and powerful one like that." Exactly. If we had worked together from the start, we could have easily subdued the creature till sunrise, Mordo said. Tao coughed lightly before she said, "While I agree Ezekiel should take things more seriously." Tao turned to look at Mordo and Caecilius as she said, "I don't understand how neither of you failed to kill this vampire lord alone, let alone Ezekiel. It was basically immune to everything we used on it, except Sanhilder's sword. We planned to restrain it and kill it with sunlight," Mordo said. Caecilius nodded in agreement as he said, "It even broke out of a combination binding spell with little issue." Tao nodded along before she asked, "Did either one of you read the small collection of books we have on vampires and how to deal with them?" Caecilius shook his head as he said, "I started the main one on vampire types, but never finished it." "And you?" Tao asked as she turned to look at Mordo. Mordo shook his head as he said, "It's not my area of study, so I never looked into them." "So you came to fight a large nest of vampires, and neither of you bothered to invite someone who knows about vampires to help?" Tao asked with a raised eyebrow. Both men shook their heads as Ezekiel snickered for a moment before Tao turned her gaze on him and said, "I don't know why you're enjoying this. You're just as responsible for this mess as they are." Tao glanced over them for a moment before she said, "I want all of you to read the complete collection of vampire books within the next month, and you will also be training with me 4 hours each day for the next month." Ezekiel wanted to argue it wasn't his fault, but the look Tao gave him stopped him as he nodded in agreement instead. Tao then pointed to the vampire lord who was floating in the air under Ezekiel's Jinjutsu as she said, "Now, I'm going to wake that creature up and show you how to deal with a vampire lord." Blade, who was next to Ezekiel, leaned in as he said, "Is this okay? He beat us like we were children the last time." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "When she's like this, it's best to let her do what she wants. It's not like we could stop her anyways. Stop talking and pay attention," Tao commanded as she slammed the vampire lord into the ground, breaking him out of the genjutsu. A moment later, the vampire lord climbed to his feet and looked around in confusion as he asked, "What happened? Wasn't I just torturing that little bastard?" He noticed everyone back on their feet along with Tao and the other new people and frowned as he looked at Ezekiel and asked, "What did you do? What were those eyes?" Tao pointed at the vampire lord as she said, "Pay attention because we only have one. When facing a vampire lord, the first thing you should do is restrain them with the proper spell." The vampire lord rushed towards Tao and hit a protective barrier before he said, "It was you. You must have helped him." Tao causally waved her hand, and a binding spell latched onto the vampire lord. As the vampire lord struggled against the bindings, she said, "This is a spell designed to hold any type of vampire. No matter how powerful they are, they will never be able to break out of it." As the vampire lord struggled against the bindings, Tao glanced at the other as she said, "The next step is the most important one, so remember it well." Tao spun her hand in a circle for a moment, and a blindingly bright portal opened up underneath the vampire lord, which made him scream in pain as his skin burned and peeled off before he dropped down into the portal itself. After the vampire lord passed through the portal, the darkness and cold that blanketed the area disappeared a moment later. Tao left the portal open and looked at everyone as she said, "You open a portal in space facing the sun and drop them into it." Ezekiel opened his mouth to speak and couldn't find the words for a few moments. Both Mordo and Caecilius also looked lost for words before Tao closed the portal up and said, "It's good all of you realize just how stupid you really are. I expect to see all of you for training, starting tomorrow. I'll hold it at the Genosha school at 3 a.m. Genosha time. Is that understood?" "Yes, master," the three of them said before Tao nodded, created a portal, and left. After Tao left, Ezekiel glanced where the vampire lord fell into the portal and said, "You know, it makes perfect sense. Now that I stop to think about it, we could have used portals the whole time." Mordo shot a glare at Ezekiel, but before he could say anything, Caecilius placed a hand on his shoulder as he said, "We're all at fault in what happened, and let's leave it at that." Mordo let out a tired sigh before he said, "You're right." Ezekiel turned towards everyone and said, "Sorry again about what happened. I'll be more serious when facing unknown enemies from now on." "Ezekiel, I need help over here." Everyone turned to see Sakura as she stood over one of the 5 torture tables using a skill. Ezekiel quickly crossed the room and stopped next to Sakura as he asked, "What's wrong?" "They're still alive." Ezekiel looked down at the man whose chest cavity was splayed open and saw his heart slowly beating. Ezekiel then glanced at the other tables and noticed the other people were all in a similar state, but still alive. Ezekiel pulled out his tablet and made a call on it, which was picked up on the second ring before a woman said, "If you're wondering about the old man, he's out of surgery and stable. Lady Tsunade, I have 5 people here in critical condition. I need your help to stabilize them," Sakura said as she worked on the person in front of her. "Sakura, how bad are they?" Ezekiel glanced at them as he said, "Someone opened them up like they were doing an autopsy." "Open a portal. I'll be there in a moment with a team," Tsunade said before she hung up the call. Ezekiel put his tablet away before he opened up a portal, and within a half a minute Tsunade, Shizune, and a medical team came out of the portal. Without a word, they each moved to a different person and went to work. Ezekiel then moved back to his original group and said, "I'll finish cleaning up down here, while you guys go and finish off any vampires we didn't kill in the tunnel." Mordo nodded before he said, "We'll double-check everything and then head back up. If they're done, I'll have Wong drop the contaminant spell and transport everyone back." Ezekiel nodded his head and said, "Thank you." Ezekiel glanced at Sanhilder before she left and said, "I'll contact you once I'm done down here." She nodded her head and then headed back with the others to go back upstairs. Blade was the only one who stayed behind as he asked, "Did she say Whistler was stable?" "Yeah. I'll take you to him once I'm done here." After that, Ezekiel went around the area and stored everything into storage scrolls. The medical equipment, books, coffin, the blood from the pool of blood. After he finished, the 5 people on the tables were stable enough to move, so Ezekiel opened a portal and let Blade go back to visit Whistler with Tsunade and the others. After that, he used an Earth-style skill to fill in the cavern and the tunnel that connected to it. It took almost an hour and a lot of chakra, but he was able to fill in everything with compacted dirt. Once finished, he double-checked the building himself one more time before he left for Genosha. He needed to take Sanhilder and the Valkyries out for breakfast and then make them watch a movie.